in our everyday speech, we use these words that we think of as having no physical content, that they just refer to pure concepts, right? That something like abstract, something like spiritual, something like ideological, we toss these words around and they enter into our lexicon. And if we ever knew exactly what they mean, we gradually forget and we just come to use them as kind of pegs to hang these ideas on. But once you get down to the etymology of them, the premise of poetic diction is that they reveal themselves, these supposedly abstract words, to have physical substrata, underpinnings that are physical. When he talks about abstract, which comes from traho in Latin, to drag, right, to drag away, and so actually, even though we think of ourselves as being able in language to transcend the material world, in fact, we are always in a kind of union between matter and form, body and soul. We're always using what he calls dead metaphor, because what's a metaphor, right? A metaphor is when you take some image or some concrete physical thing and you use it to stand in for some other activity or event or something, and often they can get very abstract. This is a simile, right? But metaphor and simile are both forms of analogy, right? My love is like a red, red rose, or you might even say my love is a red, red rose, right? You take this physical thing and you apply its qualities to the supposedly non-physical or spiritual properties of some abstract thing like love, and yet, right, even when you use these abstract words, you're always employing these kind of metaphors, these tools and symbols. And what Barfield is going to argue is that this is all language is, that there's no point at which we have abstract words that just, float in some ether. We are always, even when we use grunts and scratch in the dirt with sticks, right? At any point in the development of language, we are always taking these physical things, sounds, images, right? Human contact with objects, and we're using them to stand in for concept. And one of the things that typically we tend to assume out of this, the kind of modern materialist way of interpreting this fact would be to say, well, this just proves that all of those airy-fairy philosophical ideals, right, the things like abstraction and love, right, those are actually insubstantial. They don't exist. All it is just matter bouncing around and shoving up against itself. But if that were the case, there would be no reason to use language at all, because language, right, is this form of metaphor, right? It's using stuff to stand in for other stuff. So it must be the case that actually we do have contact with things that go beyond our senses, things like love that can't be captured fully in any one physical act or activity or even sensation, and yet, right, are only present to us, are only available to us in physical sensations and experiences. Take a word like love, right? And you know that you're talking about something and you can recognize it in a million different physical ways, right? You can see somebody giving bread to a homeless person. You can see somebody holding a lover in his arms. You can be yourself the lover and you can feel the tingle down the back of your spine. These are all physical, material things that occur. And yet, right, the thing called love, which is a thing and has an existence, is recognizable in all of these drastically different material experiences. At the same time, you have never just had a face-to-face encounter with love itself without any physical mediation. And every time you think that you've had that kind of encounter, you turn out to be wrong. So let's say even something simpler like a circle, right? You've seen metal circles, wooden circles, but the concept of circle, like the concept of love, it goes beyond any physical example. And you think you can be like, oh yes, but I can just picture a circle with no material. Try doing it as you're listening to me. Try picturing a circle. What happens? You get basically a white sheet of paper visualized in your head, and you get a black ink circle, or you get whatever color it happens to be in your mind, right? Even though you know that the circle is something beyond matter, you only ever experience it in matter. The same thing is true of love. The same thing is true of everything that matters in human experience: memory, desire, dreams. Aristotle says about this very beautifully that thought is not the same thing as perception or fantasia or sense experience or anything like that. And yet it never happens without perception or fantasia. Fantasia is a better word to use than perception because it's not aesthesis, right? It's like the word that we get fantasy from, the kind of image in our mind. We never think without those images, even when we think we're doing it. And this is Barfield's point about language, which is why it's more than just a kind of etymological curiosity that words like abstract come from a Latin word meaning to drag, right? It actually tells us something about the structure of all language, the way that it always works, because that's the way that our whole human experience works. And the errors that we fall into, both ancient and modern, almost all have to do with imagining ourselves to be living purely in one extreme. Either we imagine ourselves to only be having a physical experience, talking about physical objects, but this is kind of what Barfield thinks is exploded by quantum physics, more on that later, or we imagine ourselves to be in the pure Platonic realm of the forms, and we can float up and we have like a gender, right, which goes beyond, which is not connected in any way to our body, that has no reference to this flesh. And the reason why that kind of philosophy ends us up in these horrific contortions and causes us to do things that are really ugly to our bodies and to the bodies of others is because it's a false idea of abstraction, that we can just float out of any material container into a pure realm of the forms. And Barfield is saying, in language as in life, the two things are always unified and connected.